When you hear the word outlaw, a very specific image forms in your mind. A cold-eyed killer in a black hat, a man of chaos, a ghost who appears with the smoke of gunfire, leaves corpses behind, and vanishes into the dust. History has given us no shortage of such figures, violent, reckless, and feared. Men who lived by the gun and died by it, barely more than shadows in the chronicles of blood and dust. But then there was Butch Cassidy. And Butch broke the mold. He didn't haunt the West like a curse, he danced through it like a storm with a smile. While others took lives, he took hearts. He laughed in the face of danger, not with arrogance, but with an ease that made even his enemies wonder if they were in the presence of something more, something legendary. His name was whispered in sheriff offices, saloons, and train stations, not always with fear, but often with admiration, not because he was the fastest draw or the deadliest shot, but because he represented something rare in the outlaw world. A man who chose the path of crime not out of cruelty, but rebellion. Not for chaos, but for freedom. Where others left behind blood, Butch left behind questions. Was he a criminal or a cowboy hero? Was he a thief or a misunderstood Robin Hood? The truth, as always in the West, was as wild as the land itself. Born as Robert Leroy Parker, Butch didn't emerge from some dark abyss. He was forged under open skies in the silence of Utah plains, raised on hard work, faith, and the unforgiving hands of the American frontier. Butch didn't become an outlaw. The world simply left him no other path. He didn't seek to rule by the barrel of a gun, but when the law served only the powerful, he wrote his own code and lived by it. And he lived it well. They say Butch could charm anyone. Bankers, cowboys, politicians, even those hunting him. He wasn't just liked, he was loved. A walking contradiction. A bandit who tipped his hat to ladies. A fugitive who avoided unnecessary bloodshed. A criminal whose reputation made him a guest of honor in frontier society. Ranchers raised glasses to him. Townsfolk smiled at his approach. Even judges hesitated, unsure if the man before them truly belonged behind bars. But Butch wasn't just charm and rebellion. He had skills, the kind that made him a legend. He could ride like the wind, shoot with surgical precision, and navigate the wild with the instinct of a seasoned scout. He worked ranches in Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado, and not just as a laborer. Employers praised him. Fellow cowboys respected him. And if fate had drawn his cards differently, there's little doubt he could have lived out his days as one of the finest cattlemen in the West. But fate, as always, had other plans. Because when you're born in a land ruled by moneyed barons, crooked deputies, and laws written in ink but enforced in bullets, being good is rarely good enough. And Butch was never one to settle for the script he was handed. He didn't want a quiet life. He wanted a life worth telling stories about. And oh, did he ever write one. This isn't just the tale of a criminal. This is the story of a man who outran the law, outwitted the system, and outlived his own myth, if only just. This is the story of Butch Cassidy, the outlaw who smiled. There comes a time in every man's life when he must choose between the road ahead and the road expected. For most, the answer is simple. Take the safe route, settle down, build a life rooted in routine and comfort. But for Butch Cassidy, the road expected was never the one he could walk. Despite all his gifts, his natural leadership, his unmatched skill with horses, his charm that could win over the stoniest banker or the sternest sheriff, Butch couldn't tether himself to the soil of normal life. He tried, he really did. There were moments where the dream of a quiet ranch, a warm fire, and a name no one whispered in wanted posters nearly took hold. But the call of the unknown, the wild wind, the thrill of outsmarting men in suits and badges, that call was too loud to ignore. He could mend fences, herd cattle, and ride from dawn till dusk like any honest ranch hand. But under the sweat and dust, Butch's heart beat for something else, adventure. The kind that doesn't fit inside the fences of ranches or the rules of society. He wasn't born a villain, he became an outlaw by refusing to be caged. As the 19th century neared its end, the Old West was gasping its final breaths. Railroads carved through the wilderness, telegraph lines tangled across the horizon. Law and order crept into places once ruled by silence and survival. The untamed frontier was vanishing, eaten alive by progress and profit. Butch could see it happening, the world closing in, the wide-open ranges shrinking beneath regulations and railroad claims, the small rancher squeezed by the powerful, the independent man made into a criminal for daring to live free. And so in the face of a changing world, he did what few had the courage to do. He doubled down. For if the West was dying, he'd ride it to the end in style. Not as a footnote, but as a legend. And to do that, he would need a crew. Not just any crew, the best. Men with quick minds and quicker hands. Men who could blend into saloons, disappear into the mountains, and rob trains between breakfast and sundown without leaving a trace. Men who didn't just follow, they believed. Thus, the Wild Bunch was born. They weren't a drunken gang of killers. They were strategists. Cowboys turned ghosts, criminals with a code, and above them all stood Butch, not as a tyrant, but as a captain. He handpicked each member not for their ruthlessness, but for their brains, their bravery, their ability to work as a team. He wasn't the fastest gun. He wasn't the most feared, but he was the smartest. The Wild Bunch operated like a business. Butch ran it like a CEO who preferred horses to office chairs and open ranges to corner offices. Every robbery was meticulously planned. Every escape route was charted, with fresh horses waiting at precise intervals like an outlaw version of the Pony Express. Where other gangs left trails of blood, the Wild Bunch left dust and confusion. Butch demanded discipline, no senseless violence, no civilian casualties. He understood something rare in his world, that reputation was a more powerful weapon than any Colt revolver. As long as the public didn't hate them, the law would always be one step behind. And that was the magic of Cassidy. He was an outlaw without cruelty, a thief without hatred. He didn't crave chaos. He craved freedom. Every bank vault opened, every train robbed, every posse outwitted. It wasn't just crime. It was a middle finger to a world that told him to stay in line. And yet he smiled through it all. Butch wasn't hiding from the law. He was outrunning the future. He saw what others couldn't, that the West in all its brutal beauty was fading. And if you didn't grab your story and write it with both hands, history would write you out with a single line. So he became the author of his own legend. And he did it without spilling more blood than necessary, without turning into the monster the law claimed he was. Where others glorified mayhem, he glorified precision. Where others fought for infamy, he stole with grace. And in doing so, he became the last great outlaw of the American West, not because he was the most dangerous, but because he was the most unforgettable. This wasn't just rebellion, it was resistance. A cowboy against the clock, a leader on the edge of legend. Before the name Butch Cassidy echoed through canyon walls and newspaper headlines, before the Wild Bunch carved their names into the legend of the West, there was only Robert Leroy Parker, a boy born into a life of faith dust and quiet hardship. He came into the world on April 13, 1866, in the rugged town of Beaver, Utah, the first child of Maximilian and Ann Parker, devout Mormons, who had crossed deserts chasing a dream, a modest life built by hard work, guided by faith, and protected by community. But the West was no promised land. It was a battlefield in disguise, one where survival demanded more than prayer. It demanded endurance. The Parkers moved to Circleville, Utah, and began the hard life of homesteading. With their bare hands, they carved a farm from the unforgiving earth. But even there, with land underfoot and sky overhead, they found no peace. A dispute over their land, a strip of soil and water rights, would plant the first seeds of rebellion in young Robert S. Hart. The Parkers believed that land was theirs, paid and worked for. But in a local Mormon court where church influence was law, the decision came down against them. The judge, a church bishop, favored the opposing settler. To the Parkers, it wasn't just injustice, it was betrayal by their own faith. Around the family's dinner table, conversations turned to bitterness. Words like authority, law, and justice lost their weight. And in the quiet between sentences, young Robert began to question everything. Not long after, his life took a decisive turn. He left home and began working as a ranch hand. It was at the Marshall Ranch that he met a man who would change everything, Mike Cassidy. Cassidy wasn't just a cowboy. He was a charming rogue, a shadow who danced between lawman and outlaw, and to the impressionable Robert Parker, he was a living legend. Mike taught him more than how to ride. He taught him how to move like a ghost, shoot like a soldier, and survive like a wolf. Under Cassidy's mentorship, Robert became something else: faster, smarter, bolder. He learned to shoot from horseback at full gallop, hitting small targets with terrifying precision. He learned to read men's faces and the moods of horses. He learned that a smile could be more dangerous than a gun, and that silence often said more than words. But most importantly, he learned that the law could be a weapon just like any other, wielded by the powerful against the weak. When Mike Cassidy eventually fled the territory to escape prosecution, Robert honored him in the only way that made sense, by taking his last name. Butch Cassidy was born. But the transformation wasn't immediate. The boy from Circleville tried to live an honest life. He worked hard. He followed the cattle, branded the herds, mended fences, but every job ended the same, in restlessness. The land could not hold him, the rules could not bind him, and the silence of ranch life was louder than any gunfire. In the late 1880s, Butch wandered to the booming mining towns of the West, places like Telluride, Colorado, and Rock Springs, Wyoming. These weren't just towns, they were firestorms of temptation: music, liquor, gambling, dance halls, and fast-talking men with even faster hands. Here, Butch tasted a different life, one where fortunes changed with the roll of dice, and reputations were built in a single night. He worked hauling ore, but his real education came in the saloon shadows and racetracks. He watched the miners and gamblers, how they moved, how they lied, how they won and lost without blinking. He fell into the world of horse racing, not as a gambler but as a horseman of rare instinct. He could judge a horse by its gait, sense exhaustion before it showed. In a time where a man's life often depended on his mount, this made Butch invaluable and respected. It was during this chapter that he met future allies like Matt Warner and Tom McCarty. They were kindred spirits, men who, like Butch, hovered at the edge of the law, seduced by the promise of something bigger than just survival. And then came the moment of no return. A plan was made, a bank in Telluride, a clean job, well-timed, horses stationed, routes prepared, no bloodshed, just cash, courage, and coordination. On June 24, 1889, the plan was executed with precision. $20,000 vanished from the vault, and Butch Cassidy vanished into legend. There would be no going back now. The die was cast. He wasn't just a name. He was a whisper, a wanted poster, a story told in mining camps and rail cars. A man who had outsmarted the banks, the law, and fate itself, all without firing a single shot. In every outlaw's life, there comes a moment that divides the man he was from the legend he would become. For Butch Cassidy, that moment came in the high summer of 1889, in a town carved into the Colorado Rockies, Telluride. Telluride wasn't just another mining town. It was a melting pot of fortune-seekers, gamblers, and ambitious men chasing gold with pickaxes by day and spilling whiskey by night. It was also home to one of the most promising banks in the region, and to the kind of money that whispered promises to restless souls like Butch. Alongside his comrades Matt Warner and Tom McCarty, Butch devised a robbery that would become textbook material for generations of outlaws. Every detail was calculated: the timing, the escape routes, the horses hidden along the way, fresh, fast, and loyal to their riders. The job wasn't reckless bravado, it was precision criminal artistry. On June 24, 1889, they struck. The San Miguel Valley Bank never stood a chance. In mere minutes, the trio walked out with $28,000 in cash and gold, a sum that would be the equivalent of nearly $1 million today. No shots fired, no blood spilled, just silence, speed, and sudden infamy. The plan unfolded like clockwork. While the law scrambled, Cassidy and his gang vanished into the labyrinthine wilderness of the American West, leaving behind only boot prints and a stunned town. They headed toward Browns Park, a lawless frontier where Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming collided, a sanctuary for the outcast and the damned. There, in that secluded haven of outlaws, Butch would cross the final threshold. He was no longer just a clever cowboy with a dark side. He had become a professional criminal, a fugitive whose name would begin to echo in fear and admiration across the West. The Land of Shadows. Brown's Hole and the Transformation of a Name. Brown's Hole wasn't marked on most maps, and that was exactly the point. Nestled between river valleys and craggy canyons, it had long been a haven for horse thieves, rustlers, and those running from badgers. There were only a handful of trails in or out, and anyone unfamiliar with the terrain risked getting lost or caught. Even the bravest lawmen knew, entering Brown's Hole meant gambling with your life. For Butch, it was more than a hideout. It was a crucible, a place where the boy from Utah could shed the last remnants of his former self. He wasn't Robert Leroy Parker anymore. That name carried the weight of family, of faith, of the bitter memories from Circleville. Here, among men who lived by instinct and bullet, he became fully and officially known as Butch Cassidy. The Butch was said to have come from a stint working in a meat market in Wyoming, a mundane job for an extraordinary future. But the Cassidy was chosen with reverence. It was a tribute to Mike Cassidy, the outlaw who had mentored him, who had passed on the code of survival and rebellion. By adopting his name, Butch wasn't just paying homage. He was stepping into the legacy of defiance that Mike had once embodied. In the quiet of the hideout, Cassidy lived a double life. He worked ranches and blended into rural communities. He was polite, respected, even admired. People remembered him as honest, charming, and competent, a man you could trust with your herd or your secrets. But when the time came, he disappeared, and a bank would fall or a train would bleed gold. This alternating rhythms of heat and cold, of fame and disappearance, became a signature tactic. After every heist, he would retreat, bury his notoriety beneath dirt-stained gloves and trail dust. He would become the ranch hand again, the cowboy, the quiet man with the sharp grin and an eye on the horizon. Lawmen found it nearly impossible to keep track of him. In 1 week, he might be helping deliver calves on a Utah ranch. The next, he'd vanish into the desert, and somewhere a vault would be found empty, the horses long gone. What separated Butch Cassidy from most outlaws wasn't just his intelligence or charm, it was his discipline. While others burned fast and fell hard, Cassidy played the long game. He didn't rob in desperation. He didn't act out of drunken impulse. He robbed because it was a strategy, a strike against the power structures that had once humiliated his family, a way to carve out freedom in a world fenced by rules he never agreed to. In this, Brown's Hole and places like it, Robber's Roost, Hole in the Wall, weren't just hideouts. They were Cassidy's castles, strongholds from which he and his future gang, the Wild Bunch, would launch an unprecedented reign of outlawry. And yet, Cassidy's story at this stage wasn't entirely one of crime. It was about craft. It was about the transformation of a young man from a forgotten farm into a figure of legend, one who stole not just money, but the imagination of a nation. Not all legends begin with glory. Some are forged in the quiet bitterness of betrayal and confinement. For Butch Cassidy, the next chapter of his life wasn't a heist or a grand escape. It was a cell, and a sentence that would alter his course forever. The charge was horse theft, a crime that in the rugged territories of the American West could be tantamount to murder. Some say it was a setup, orchestrated by powerful cattlemen who saw Cassidy as a thorn in their side. Others argue that Butch made a reckless choice, purchasing a horse for $5 without proper documentation, knowing full well the beast had been stolen. Regardless of the truth, what matters is the consequence. Butch Cassidy was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 2 years in the Wyoming State Penitentiary in Laramie. Behind stone walls and iron bars, the man who had once outrun posses and dazzled saloons now faced silence, reflection, and transformation. During those 18 months, for he was released on good behavior before completing the full term, something in Cassidy hardened. He entered the prison as a clever cowboy flirting with outlawry. He left as a man with a mission. If, before he had stolen for thrill or necessity, now his vision expanded. He had been humiliated, caged, not by his own mistakes, but, as he saw it, by a system rigged against men like him, the poor, the independent, the unconnected. It was the land barons, the railroad tycoons, and the banking elites who had wealth, power, and protection. So Butch Cassidy did what the system never expected. He took their punishment and turned it into his greatest lesson. He would never again act alone. He would never again leave his fate to chance. If the world saw him as a criminal, he would become the best, not out of malice but out of mastery. What was born in that prison was not just an outlaw, it was the blueprint of an empire. When Butch Cassidy stepped out of prison, he didn't vanish into obscurity. He re-emerged with purpose, and he wasn't alone. Over the months that followed, he began to recruit men, not merely as partners in crime, but as soldiers in a campaign against the American elite. Each was chosen with care, for skill, loyalty, intelligence. Among them were names that would carve themselves into the lore of the West: Harry Longabore, the Sundance Kid; Elsie Lay, Harvey Kid Curry Logan, Ben Kilpatrick, and others. Together, they would form a gang unlike anything the territories had seen before. They called themselves many things: the Train Robbers Syndicate, the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, but history remembers them best as the Wild Bunch. Butch was the brains, the strategist, the architect of every operation. Where most outlaws relied on brute force and chaos, Cassidy brought discipline, planning, and a surprising degree of restraint. He was a criminal with a conscience, and his crew, despite their deadliness, followed his lead. Their targets were not the poor or the weak. They aimed higher: banks, trains, railroad depots, and large cattle syndicates. These were the empires that Butch believed had crushed the common man, so he hit them with surgical precision. What truly set the Wild Bunch apart, however, was their logistical genius. Cassidy understood one fundamental truth of outlawry: you don't need to outrun the law, you only need to outrun their horses. So he built a network of escape, a system more complex and refined than any law enforcement group could have predicted. Along each getaway route, he and his men placed relay stations with fresh horses, tended to by trusted allies. These horses weren't just replacements. They were hand-picked, well-fed, trained, and fast. After a robbery, the Wild Bunch would gallop at full speed to the first stop, swap horses, and repeat, sometimes 3 or 4 times across miles of terrain. Each fresh mount meant they could ride faster, longer, and further than any posse trying to follow them. By the time the law reached the first station, the gang would be 30 miles ahead, already vanishing into the dust. This was Butch Cassidy's outlaw genius. Where others fled in chaos, he disappeared by design. The results of this operation were astounding. One by one, banks fell across the West, trains were halted mid-desert, safes blown open with dynamite, and lawmen left chasing ghosts. Cassidy's team became the most successful outlaw crew in the history of the West, not by brutality but by brilliance. They dressed well, they laughed often. They were bizarrely liked by many townsfolk, even admired. To some they were Robin Hoods on horseback. To others they were myths made flesh. But at their core they were a crew bound not by greed, but by rebellion. A rebellion against the closing frontier, against the encroaching corporations, against the narrowing of American freedom. And at the center of it all was Butch Cassidy, the outlaw who refused to kill when he could outsmart, who planned heists like an engineer, and who ran his gang like a businessman. He wasn't just escaping the law. He was rewriting what it meant to be an outlaw. In the ever-growing legend of Butch Cassidy, no man becomes a myth alone. Around him, a cast of unforgettable figures emerged, men and women who carved their names into the bones of the West, not merely as accomplices but as legends in their own right. These were not reckless outlaws thrown together by circumstance. They were chosen, shaped, and refined under Cassidy's command. His gang was a rare brotherhood of precision, loyalty, and rebellion, each member bringing a deadly skill, a vital trait, or an aura of mystique that made the Wild Bunch something greater than just a criminal crew. They were an institution, a storm, moving across the territories. Among them stood Elsie Lay, Cassidy's closest confidant and most dependable right hand. Elsie wasn't loud or flashy. He was the anchor, the quiet strategist who balanced Butch's charisma with a grounded resolve. In many ways, Lay was the man Cassidy trusted above all others. Their friendship was forged not just in stolen cash and outlaw hideouts, but in values: mutual respect, calculated risk, and a shared code of loyalty that went deeper than blood. When Cassidy needed a second brain, a calm voice during chaos, or a man to lead in his absence. It was Elsie Lay who stepped into the role without hesitation. Then came Kid Curry, born Harvey Logan, whose name alone sparked tremors across the western frontier. If Cassidy represented the brain and Lay the backbone, Curry was the fire, the unpredictable force of raw violence that lawmen feared most. Where Cassidy avoided bloodshed whenever possible, Curry leaned into it. Quick-tempered, vengeful, and devastatingly accurate with a gun, Curry was a nightmare when crossed. He wasn't cruel without cause, but he saw death as a natural tool of survival. Entire posses hesitated at the mention of his name, and for good reason. He left a trail of empty shells and still bodies behind him wherever he rode. Cassidy tolerated this edge of darkness because Curry, for all his fury, was fiercely loyal and terrifyingly effective. Alongside them, the gang gained both elegance and cold efficiency in the form of Harry Longabore, the infamous Sundance Kid. With the look of a gentleman gambler and the reflexes of a professional killer, Sundance was both myth and mystery. Reserved, almost aloof in demeanor, he carried himself with a quiet self-assurance. Where Curry would threaten, Sundance didn't need to speak. His revolver did the talking, and few ever lived to talk back. Women were drawn to his chiseled calm, men didn't dare challenge it. Cassidy saw in him a mirror, a man shaped by the lawless landscape, but guided by his own moral compass. Together they would form one of the most legendary duos in American folklore. And then, unexpectedly, came the woman who would baffle historians and haunt Pinkerton files for decades, Etta Place. Described as beautiful, enigmatic, and dangerously competent, Etta was no simple companion. She rode with the wild bunch, not behind it. She matched Sundance in both marksmanship and poise, and never flinched under pressure. Some said she was a schoolteacher. Others whispered she had been a woman of high society, or even a spy. No one knows. What mattered was that she could hold her own in gunfights, vanish across borders with forged documents, and maintain a stoic silence under interrogation. In many ways, Etta represented the unspoken truth of the Wild Bunch. They were more than outlaws. They were ghosts slipping through the cracks of the civilized world, living by codes no badge could decipher. But what truly made the Wild Bunch unstoppable wasn't just the people. It was the infrastructure they built around their legend. Butch Cassidy didn't just rob banks. He mapped routes. He studied terrain. He constructed a living network of safe havens and escape corridors that rivaled the sophistication of any military operation of the time. It was called the Outlaw Trail, and it stretched across the American West like an invisible vein, pulsing with secrecy, loyalty, and survival. At the heart of this web were three strongholds so well hidden, so geographically strategic, that they became legends in their own right. The first was Hole in the Wall, nestled in the remote red rock formations of Wyoming. A natural fortress, it could only be accessed through a narrow canyon, easily defensible, nearly impossible to invade. It served as a central meeting place for dozens of outlaw gangs, but none ruled it like Cassidy's crew. There they had food, weapons, shelter, and eyes watching every possible approach. A lawman entering Hole in the Wall did so at his own peril, often never returning. The second was Robber's Roost, buried in the labyrinthine desert canyons of southern Utah. To even reach it required days of brutal travel through scorching heat, deceptive rock passes, and unmarked trails. Cassidy himself homesteaded nearby, disguising the base as a humble ranch. Once inside, the roost offered not only protection but privacy. It was a place where the gang could rest, plan, and disappear completely. The canyons were so vast and identical that anyone unfamiliar would be hopelessly lost. Perfect conditions for a band of outlaws who knew every crevice by heart. And finally, there was Brown's Hole straddling the borders of Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Remote, lush, and vast, it served as a neutral zone for rustlers, bandits, and outcasts alike. Cassidy had allies there, ranchers who owed him favors, locals who turned a blind eye. From Brown's Hole, the Wild Bunch could cross state lines within minutes, evading jurisdiction with ease. The law could chase, but they'd always arrive just a few hours too late. These fortresses weren't just hiding spots. They were choke points of power, connected by the Outlaw Trail, a clandestine highway stretching from Canada to Mexico. Along the route, Trusted informants provided food, clean horses, and false papers. Every turn, every canyon, every plateau was chosen with intent. Posses, chasing the wild bunch, often found themselves wandering in circles, exhausted and defeated, as the gang vanished over the horizon once more. In the end, it wasn't a brute force or violence that made the wild bunch so feared. It was the genius of their leader, the skill of his companions, and the terrain itself, which seemed to rise up in their defense. They didn't just escape the law, they outsmarted it, outsprinted it, outlived it, and for a time, just long enough to become immortal, they ruled the untamable West. The wild bunch rode high through the late 1890s, seemingly untouchable, smiling in photographs, sharing stolen riches, outmaneuvering posses, and turning crime into craft. But the world was changing, and the romantic days of the Wild West were nearing their final breaths. The railroads, those vast steel serpents that stretched across the American continent, had become the nervous system of a modernizing nation, and as they expanded, so did the stakes, no longer content to be the victims of clever horsemen with dynamite and daring. The railroad struck back with something far more cold and relentless than any posse: the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The Pinkertons weren't a typical law enforcement body. They were a private force with government-like reach, hired guns with deep pockets, and zero tolerance for failure. At the request of the Union Pacific and other major railway companies, the Pinkertons created a specialized unit, one designed for one purpose only: to hunt and destroy the wild bunch. This was no amateur group of sheriffs and deputies. The Pinkertons operated like a modern paramilitary team. They developed detailed dossiers, compiled eyewitness reports, tracked stolen bills, and even placed undercover agents in frontier towns. And then came their ultimate weapon: the Union Pacific Mounted Rangers, a tactical pursuit unit deployed from a specially designed train, armed to the teeth and ready to ride at a moment's notice. This train was a beast, equipped with sleeping quarters, a dining car, and most importantly, horse stalls to release mounted agents directly from the rail to the trail. With elite horsemen, expert marksmen, and veteran tacticians aboard, the train could be launched the moment telegraphs announced another wild bunch heist. It was modern justice made mobile, a steel-clad promise that no outlaw could outrun the future forever. At first, Butch Cassidy seemed unfazed. The man had escaped far worse after all. He still held favor in towns, had a network of allies, and could vanish into the canyons faster than most posses could saddle up. But even he could feel the noose tightening. The outlaw trail was no longer safe. Names were known, faces were printed. The Fort Worth photo had been turned into a wanted poster plastered across the West. And now the Pinkertons were coming, not with questions, but with bullets. It was then that Butch made a stunning decision. He tried to surrender, not in defeat, but in negotiation. Ever the strategist, Cassidy realized that perhaps a deal could be struck. He had never killed a man in cold blood, at least not proven. His reputation, while infamous, lacked the cruelty that stained others. He reached out, using his high-powered attorney, Douglas Preston, to set up a meeting with the Union Pacific Railroad, hoping to strike a bargain. If they guaranteed him amnesty, he would retire from crime, perhaps even work for them as a security advisor. The meeting was to be discreet, held in the vast emptiness of the frontier. Cassidy arrived at the agreed location, watching the horizon for the train that would carry the railroad officials. Hours passed. The train never came. Time slipped by. Dust rose and settled. Butch began to feel the stirrings of betrayal clawing at his gut. Had they lured him here to be ambushed? Was this the end? He left a note, furious and heartbroken. "Damn you, Preston. You've double-crossed me. I waited all day. Tell the Union Pacific to go to hell and you can go with them. Butch Cassidy." The irony, bitter and sharp, came later. The train had been delayed, not by deceit, but by mechanical failure. The men had come. They arrived late, but by the time they did, the greatest chance at peace Butch Cassidy would ever have was already gone with the wind. Burned by what he saw as betrayal, Cassidy returned to the only life he knew, but now with a deeper sense of urgency. The outlaw trail was compromised. The Wild West was no longer wide open. Telegraph wires hung across the land like spiderwebs, catching outlaws with every snap of code. Motorcars were arriving. Civilization, relentless and fast, was taking the frontier inch by inch. So Cassidy did what legends do when their land begins to die. He looked for new horizons. Argentina. The idea wasn't as mad as it sounded. The Pampas offered wide lands, fertile soil, and booming cattle economies. In Patagonia, a man could vanish, start over, art. And in Cassidy's mind, that future still gleamed with hope. But hope costs money, and so with Sundance and Etta by his side, Butch set out on one final string of robberies, not for greed, but as a means of escape. The first was the Tipton train robbery, a classic Wild Bunch move pulled in the summer of 1900. Planned with precision, executed with confidence, it netted them enough to begin preparations. But one was not enough. They needed more. And so came the bold daylight raid in Winnemucca, Nevada, the Wild Bunch's last true masterpiece on American soil. On September 19, 1900, Cassidy and his crew stormed the First National Bank of Winnemucca, taking an estimated $32,000, a massive haul at the time. They vanished as they always had, into dust, into myth. But this time, they didn't head for hole in the wall. They turned their sights toward the sea. The plan was set. Money in hand, aliases prepared, they would go not west, but south, across oceans and borders, to a land where the Pinkertons couldn't reach. Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and Etta Place would soon trade the dust of Utah for the winds of the Argentine Pampas. They left the frontier behind, not in chains, but on their own terms. Their names still rang through the saloons and sheriff offices of the West, but their trail would now vanish across oceans. A chapter had closed, but the story, the legend, was far from over. When Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and the mysterious Etta Place boarded the ship bound for South America in early 1901, they weren't just fleeing the relentless reach of the Pinkertons, they were chasing a final dream, a second chance, a fresh frontier. The vast open lands of Argentina promised something the American West no longer could: anonymity. They arrived in Buenos Aires, blending seamlessly with the upper crust. Disguised as respectable landowners and foreign investors, they cut elegant figures in the bustling capital. Few would suspect that these charming newcomers were, in truth, two of the most wanted men in North America. Cassidy and Longabaugh, ever the tacticians, quickly moved westward, away from the eyes of the authorities into the endless grasslands of the Patagonian frontier. There, in the windswept heart of Argentina's cattle country, they built a ranch under the names James Ryan and Harry Place. Their days became strangely peaceful. They wore gaucho hats instead of cowboy boots. They learned Spanish. They managed cattle, oversaw ranch hands, and made genuine attempts to leave the outlaw life behind. It was a quiet existence, the kind Cassidy had once scoffed at during his time in Wyoming, but now it offered refuge, and for a time they truly lived it. But peace is fragile when your past is soaked in dynamite and gunpowder. The money from their final U.S. heists began to run thin. Livestock profits were modest, and rumors started to reach the Southern Hemisphere, rumors that the Pinkertons knew where they were. It didn't take long for suspicions to take root. Locals noticed that the foreign ranchers carried themselves with a certain edge, a confidence not born from agriculture, but from years dodging bullets. One neighbor, reportedly recognizing a mule used in an earlier robbery, began to ask questions. Butch Cassidy, who had once eluded entire poses with a smile, now looked over his shoulder. With fear tightening its grip, the pair fell back on their old trade. They began robbing gold shipments and payroll transports, not out of greed but necessity. The crimes were swift, professional, and ruthless in execution, mirroring their American exploits. But this time, they were operating in an unfamiliar land, without the network of sympathizers and safe houses they once relied on. Even so, they moved with the same efficiency, scouting terrain, identifying escape routes, and relying on the proven formula of surprise and speed. In Bolivia and parts of Argentina, the Wild Bunch was reborn, though now smaller, quieter, and more cautious. And then, in the midst of this resurgence, she vanished. Etta Place, the elusive, elegant shadow who had ridden beside the Sundance Kid through continents and crimes, simply disappeared. Around 1907, her presence fades from the historical record like morning mist. One moment she was there, photographed in New York, dining with Cassidy and Longabaugh in Buenos Aires, riding across the Pampas, and then nothing. No arrests, no sightings, no farewell letters. Some say Butch sent her home to the United States for her safety. Others believe she may have fallen ill and died in secret. A few more romantic souls suggest she faked her own death and began life anew under yet another name. But whatever the truth, no confirmed trace of Etta Place has ever surfaced since. Her identity, her origin, her fate, even her real name, remains one of the great enduring mysteries of the Old West. For decades, researchers, historians, and writers have pored over archives, chased leads, and interviewed distant descendants, all in vain. Etta became more than a woman. She became legend. And for Butch and Sundance, her absence left a void no gold could fill. With their closest confidant gone and enemies closing in from all sides, they would face the final act of their story alone, pursued not just by the law but by time itself. In the dry, unforgiving heat of Bolivia 1908, the legend of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid faced its final chapter, or so the official story claims. After years of evading the law across continents, the duo found themselves once again in the shadow of danger. With Etta Place gone, their crew dispersed, and Pinkerton pressure extending even into South America, Butch and Sundance were worn, hunted, and running out of time. Their last known heist took place on November 4th, 1908, near the Bolivian mining town of Tupiza. Disguised as guards, they held up a mule train transporting the Aramayo Mine Company's payroll, an audacious theft, but one consistent with their pattern. They made off with thousands of Bolivian pesos, then retreated into the rugged hills near the village of San Vicente, unaware they were walking into a trap. According to Bolivian military records, a local innkeeper, possibly recognizing one of the stolen mules, alerted the authorities. That night, Bolivian cavalry surrounded the small adobe house where the two Americans had taken refuge. When dawn broke, gunfire shattered the silence. The official version tells a grim tale. During the firefight, Sundance was fatally wounded, collapsing under a hail of bullets. With no way out, surrounded and alone, Butch Cassidy allegedly turned his revolver on his dying friend, then on himself, ending the storied legacy of the Wild Bunch in a lonely foreign land. The bodies were never conclusively identified. Buried in unmarked graves in San Vicente's small cemetery, the two gringos were mourned by no one, and remembered by everyone. But just as the dust began to settle, a different story began to take root, one far less certain yet infinitely more compelling. Across the American West in the 1920s and 1930s, whispers began to surface. Sightings, conversations, letters. People swore they had seen Butch Cassidy alive. Not just once or twice, but over and over again, in places like Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Oregon, and even as far east as New York. Some claimed he had returned under a new name, living quietly as a cattleman. Others said he confessed his true identity only on his deathbed. A few alleged he had visited old friends, sharing stories over campfires, older, grayer, but unmistakably him. Even members of his own family gave conflicting accounts. Some insisted he had survived, lived a quiet life, and was buried under an assumed name. Others dismissed the stories as romantic fiction, yet the fact that such rumors persisted for decades, long after his supposed death, has kept the mystery alive. Numerous books, documentaries, and even forensic investigations have attempted to solve the puzzle. Graves were exhumed, bones were tested. Still, no definitive proof emerged, no bullet-pierced skull, no traceable trail. What we were left with is a man who vanished as completely as he appeared, leaving behind a trail of charm, mystery, and rebellion. Whether Butch Cassidy died in Bolivia in 1908 or quietly faded into the twilight of the American frontier, one thing is certain. He became immortal. He wasn't just an outlaw, he was a symbol of resistance, of wit, of charisma, and of a fading world where freedom was taken at gunpoint, and loyalty was the only currency that mattered. Butch Cassidy lives on, not just in the dust-covered pages of history, but in films, books, songs, and in the imaginations of all those who long for one last ride through the untamed West. And if you've enjoyed this journey through the legend, mystery, and raw truth of Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch, we invite you to join our posse. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next outlaw saga. There are still more legends to uncover and many myths left to chase. Because out here, in the land of the free and the bold, the story never really ends.